I am told that in the aftermath, after the paramedics had left and the bishop had been called, that I dropped the consecrated host. It is a moment of profound failure for a priest, a sacrilege born of pure, unadulterated shock, and I have no memory of it. None. A blank space where the most sacred moment of my life, my priesthood, should have been etched. All I remember is the sight, the sheer impossible sight. Little Leo Martinez, mute, crippled, a boy shackled in a body the doctors had long given up on. A boy who had never moved without a struggle, never uttered a sound. He rose. He just rose. From his mother's side in the third pew. It wasn't a stand. There was no push, no strain, no wobble of frail limbs. He simply untethered. A sudden silent shift in the air itself. One moment, slumped in his customized wheelchair, head tilted, eyes glazed over as they always were during Mass. A small, still cross for his suffering parents. The next, he was lighter than air. He floated. His frail form, gaunt and twisted by the ravages of his disease, ascended. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with an agonizing, dreamlike slowness. Upward, in the incense-laden air that moments before had carried only the familiar scent of devotion and comfort. A new, sharp tang of ozone seemed to pierce my nostrils, though I know now that was only my mind grasping at some explanation. My hands, poised above the chalice, were still trembling from the consecration, the transubstantiation freshly wrought. I had just elevated the body of Christ, held it aloft for the faithful, for the eyes that believed. And then Leo moved. He broke every law I knew, every scientific principle I'd ever accepted as absolute. He defied gravity, defied medicine, defied the very definition of human frailty. His knees cleared the top of the pew. His small wasted feet, which had never borne his weight, dangled freely. He continued to drift upwards, slowly, steadily, until he was level with the top of the pews. He hung there, suspended, a small human anachronism, a living, breathing, floating contradiction. The collective gasp from the 100 souls in St. Jude's was not one sound, but a tapestry of sudden, ragged exhalations, a single unified breath drawn in terror and disbelief. It ripped through the hushed reverence of the Mass, tearing the sacred silence to shreds. I saw it on their faces. The confusion, then the dawning horror, the stark, impossible realization. Maria, Leo's mother, slumped against the pew, a soundless scream contorting her face. Her hands, which had only seconds before been clutching her rosary, were now pressed against her mouth, stifling a cry that was too primal for sound. David, his face usually a mask of weary resignation, had gone ashen. He was trying to push himself up, but his limbs seemed to have locked, rooted to the spot by the sheer, unholy audacity of what was unfolding before him. And Leo, his eyes, that was the most terrifying part. Always vacant, always lost in some internal, unreachable world of autism, they were now wide open, brilliant. Not the dull, unfocused gaze I had known for 10 years, but a piercing, intelligent clarity that burned with an intensity I had never seen in any human being, let alone a boy who had been blind to the world around him. They were fixed with an unwavering, terrifying focus, not on me, the priest, not on his mother, not on the gaping mouths of the congregation. They were fixed, absolutely and utterly, upon the crucifix above the altar, upon the suffering Christ. And there was something in that gaze, something knowing, something ancient, something that spoke of a world beyond our understanding, beyond our suffering, beyond our very capacity for reason. My own heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence that had somehow returned, a heavier, more oppressive silence than before. My breath hitched. I felt the heat of the host in my trembling fingers, the delicate wafer suddenly feeling like a burning ember, an impossible weight. My mind screamed, this was not possible. This was sacrilege, or miracle, or madness. I was a man of God, a man of faith, trained in theology, steeped in tradition, and yet every fiber of my being recoiled from what my eyes presented. Every doctrine, every scientific principle, every comforting certainty of the ordered world was dissolving, melting away into an absurd, terrifying truth. His small body, usually so heavy with illness, seemed utterly weightless, almost translucent in the morning light filtering through the stained glass windows. The air itself shimmered around him. Not a trick of the light. Something real. Something other. The faint, almost imperceptible undulations of his frail chest were the only sign of life, of breath. Otherwise, he was a statue of impossible grace, a suspended icon carved from flesh and bone. A boy in defiance of all known laws. A living, breathing, floating impossibility. I felt a cold sweat prickle my scalp. My throat was dry, tighter than a noose. What was I seeing? Was I hallucinating? Was this a trick of the devil? Or was this God? Was this the hand of the Almighty? tearing through the veil of our everyday lives with such violent, undeniable force. The sheer terror of the unknown gripped me. The absolute mind-shattering proof that the world was not what I believed it to be. That there were forces at play, realities lurking just beneath the surface, that could shatter the very fabric of our understanding in a single, silent, levitating moment. The crucifix, his unwavering gaze, it drew my eyes too. The stylized, suffering figure of Christ. For a moment, a fleeting, terrifying moment, I imagined the Christ figure leaning forward, reaching out a wooden hand to the boy suspended in midair. The thought was blasphemy, madness, but it seared itself into my mind. Because what else could explain this? What earthly power could cause a child, condemned to silence and stillness, to simply rise? The congregation remained frozen, a tableau of disbelief and terror. No one moved. No one spoke. The collective breath held, suspended just like Leo. My fingers tightened around the host, then spasped. It slipped. A white disc, the very body of Christ, tumbling from my grasp. My vision blurred. A sound like rushing water filled my ears, the roar of a dam breaking inside my head. And then, everything after that, for a time, is gone. Just the image. The indelible, soul-searing image of little Leo Martinez, rising with an impossible clarity, defying the grave that awaited him, and fixing his burning gaze on the crucified God above. A moment of scandalous, profound contradiction. A moment that promised a revelation I was not yet prepared to comprehend. The memory of that Sunday, of little Leo floating, of the host slipping from my grasp, is still a raw, living thing within me. Even now, years later, it is a memory that overshadows so many others, dividing my life as a priest into a clear before and after. But to truly comprehend the astonishing grace of that after, one must first understand the profound and agonizing before. Before the impossible light, there was only the shadow. Before the miracle, there was Leo Martinez. He was, for 10 long years, our parish's shared sorrow, a living, breathing testament to the most vexing question that assails every faithful heart, the question of suffering. I had baptized him myself a decade prior, on a gloriously bright autumn afternoon. He was a robust, healthy infant then, his tiny fingers curling tight around mine as I poured the holy water over his head, anointing him with the oil of catechumens, welcoming him into God's family. David, his father, a man whose hands were built for carpentry, strong and calloused, had beamed with a pride that filled the sacristy. Maria, his mother, had wept tears of pure, unadulterated joy, her face radiant with the boundless love only a new mother can know. They were good people, David and Maria, simple in their faith, hard-working, pillars of our small community. No one, looking at that beautiful squalling bundle in my arms, could have ever foreseen the cross that would soon become their unbearable burden. The first whispers of concern began around his 2nd birthday. He hadn't started speaking, not even those rudimentary words that mothers cherish. Maria, ever diligent, would tell me, "He just seems to be in his own little world, Father." We dismissed it then as a late bloomer, a quiet spirit, but the quiet deepened. By age 3, Leo had retreated almost entirely into a silent world of nonverbal autism. His gaze, once so bright and curious, would often drift past you, unfocused, as if seeing something beyond our understanding, or perhaps nothing at all. He wouldn't respond to his name, wouldn't engage in the simple games other children his age reveled in. It was like watching a window slowly fog over, obscuring the vibrant personality that once lay behind it. The autism, agonizing as it was for David and Maria, was only the first cruel twist of the knife. Barely a year after the autism diagnosis, the physical symptoms began to manifest. A slight tremor in his hands, a stumble in his gait, a weakness that seemed to sap the very strength from his small frame. More doctors, more tests, more specialists. The names of diseases, cold and clinical, began to populate their lives like unwelcome tenants. Progressive myopathy, muscular dystrophy, conditions that promised only slow, relentless decline. The final, crushing diagnosis settled upon them like a shroud, a viciously degenerative muscular disease, one that would slowly, inexorably cripple his body, eventually robbing him of all movement, and ultimately his life. It was a rare, aggressive form, the doctors explained with hushed, regretful tones. There was no cure, no treatment, only management of symptoms, and the grim prognosis of progressive atrophy. Leo, the healthy infant I had cradled, was now a beautiful boy, trapped in a silent, failing prison of flesh. His limbs, once chubby and eager, began to contort, his muscles wasting away. By the time he was 7, he was confined to a wheelchair, his head often drooping, his delicate hands curled inwards, incapable of grasping even the simplest toy. His beautiful face, once so full of nascent joy, was often slack, his eyes still holding that distant, vacant quality that hinted at an inner world we could not penetrate, yet could not deny existed. He was beautiful, yes, with his dark hair and long eyelashes, but it was a heartbreaking beauty, like a precious, antique doll that had been broken but still retained its fragile grace. The weight of this cross began to crush David and Maria. Their faith, once a comforting certainty, became a battleground. David, the diligent carpenter, whose hands could build anything from a sturdy oak table to the framework of a new home, found himself utterly powerless to build a future for his son. His quiet devotion, which had once manifested in consistent attendance at Mass and a simple, abiding trust in God's plan, curdled into a resentful silence. I would see him after Mass, standing apart, his gaze fixed on the ground, his shoulders slumped not just from the day's labor, but from an invisible spiritual weight. His replies to my sympathetic inquiries became monosyllabic, hollow. He still came to church, but it felt less like worship and more like an obligation, a grim showing up, perhaps to tacitly challenge God himself, to demand an answer for this unspeakable injustice. The crucifix in their living room, I knew, had begun to feel less like a symbol of hope and more like an accusation. Maria, on the other hand, turned to frantic, desperate bargaining. Her prayers, once whispered with gentle reverence, became urgent, tear-soaked pleas, bargains offered into the dark emptiness she felt surrounding her. "Please, God," she would beg, late into the night, after Leo had finally settled into his fitful sleep. "Take me instead. Just give him back his voice. Just let him walk again." She would make novenas, light candles, scour the lives of saints for any patron who might understand their particular agony. But each unanswered prayer, each passing day that Leo remained unchanged, seemed to chip away at the very foundations of her soul, leaving her hollowed out, despairing. Her vibrant maternal spirit was slowly being extinguished under the relentless pressure of grief. Her eyes, once so full of a mother's fierce love, were now often red-rimmed and perpetually tired, holding an ocean of unshed tears. I visited them often, as a priest is bound to do, and as a friend, I would bring them the Eucharist, hoping the body of Christ would bring them some measure of strength, some peace. I would sit with them in their meticulously clean yet increasingly somber home, the air often thick with the unspoken anguish that hung heavy between them. I would offer the Church's comfort, theologically sound words about the mystery of suffering, the promise of eternal life, the redemptive power of the cross. But my words, even to my own ears, often felt like pebbles tossed into an ocean of grief, small, insignificant, incapable of making even the slightest ripple against the vastness of their sorrow. What comfort could I truly offer when I saw Maria's raw pain, David's hardened despair, and Leo's vacant stare? My pastoral heart ached, and sometimes I confess my own faith would waver, not in God's existence but in my understanding of his inscrutable will. Leo himself simply existed. He was fed, bathed, clothed with an endless patience born of parental love, even as that love was tested to its breaking point. He rarely made a sound, save for the occasional soft moan when he was uncomfortable, or a distant hum that seemed to emanate from some private corner of his mind. He was entirely dependent, a fragile, beautiful shell from which the vibrant spirit seemed to have receded. There were moments, fleeting and precious, when Maria swore she saw a flicker of recognition, a glint of intelligence in his eyes, but they were always gone as quickly as they appeared, leaving her with a renewed sense of loneliness, a renewed ache for the son she knew was in there, somewhere, but could not reach. His presence in our parish, slumped listlessly in his small wheelchair in the third pew every Sunday, was a silent sermon, a constant poignant reminder of life's fragility and suffering's mystery. Every parishioner knew Leo, knew his story, and held him and his family in their prayers, yet always with a heavy heart, knowing that their prayers too seemed to fall short. There was a collective resignation, a quiet despair that had settled over us all regarding Leo. He was our parish's cross, our shared ache, a challenge to our understanding of a loving God. We all loved him, but we also, in the deepest, most unspoken corners of our hearts, longed for his suffering to end, one way or another. He was a beautiful boy, trapped in a silent, failing prison of flesh, and for 10 years we watched, helpless, as the walls of that prison slowly, inexorably closed in. There seemed no escape, no reprieve, no answer to the silent screams of his parents' souls, only the slow, agonizing march toward an inevitable, sorrowful conclusion. And yet, even in that profound darkness, a seed of an idea, a flicker of an impossible hope, was about to be planted, not by me, nor by David or Maria, but by someone whose faith, in its profound simplicity, was utterly unshakable. And yet, even in that profound darkness, a seed of an idea, a flicker of an impossible hope, was about to be planted, not by me, nor by David or Maria, but by someone whose faith, in its profound simplicity, was utterly unshakable. That someone was Elena, Maria's mother, Leo's abuela. Elena was a woman forged in an older world, where faith wasn't a philosophical construct to be dissected in a seminary or debated over coffee, but the very air you breathed, the solid ground beneath your feet. She wasn't educated in the academic sense, had never delved into complex theological texts, but her heart held a wisdom far deeper than any book could teach. Her knowledge of God came from a lifetime of talking to Him, of trusting Him, not with a blind, unquestioning acceptance, but with the tenacious, relentless hope of a child who knows her Father loves her, even when His ways are mysterious. When the doctors spoke of percentages and prognoses, Elena heard the distant murmur of a different conversation, one held between heaven and earth, a conversation she firmly believed God was always willing to resume, if only we knew how to listen and how to ask. I remember her well. Elena had a presence that was both unassuming and formidable. Her face, etched with the lines of 70 years, was a map of prayer and toil. Her hands, gnarled from years of gardening and countless rosaries, always seemed to be in motion, whether braiding Maria's hair as a child or gently stroking Leo's forehead. While Maria and David had become accustomed to the sterile scent of clinics and the hushed, disheartening tones of specialists, Elena's world revolved around the scent of beeswax candles, old incense, and the comforting rhythm of Latin prayers softly recited. For her, suffering was not an endpoint to be managed, but an opportunity for grace, a pathway, however thorny, to a deeper encounter with the divine. She didn't dismiss medicine. She simply knew its limits, understanding that some battles required a different kind of armor, a different kind of weapon. And for her, that weapon was prayer, honed and directed by the intercession of the saints. She arrived at Maria and David's home one sweltering afternoon, a few days after Leo's parents had received yet another grim prognosis, though not the final one that would break them entirely. The air in their small living room was thick with unspoken grief, a palpable weight that seemed to press down on the furniture, on their very shoulders. David sat on the worn sofa, staring at the television, but not seeing it. His jaw clenched, his hands idly twisting a loose thread on his trousers. Maria moved through the house like a ghost, tidying things that didn't need tidying, each movement an echo of her inner agitation. Leo was in his special chair by the window, his head tilted, gazing out at the blur of the afternoon, as if the world outside was just a series of indistinct colors and shapes. His own internal landscape a similar silent fog. Elena entered not with the usual flurry of questions or offerings of food, but with a quiet, purposeful dignity. She didn't offer platitudes or demand explanations. She simply embraced Maria, a long, silent hug that conveyed more comfort than any words could. Then she went to Leo, kneeling beside his chair, her eyes, usually bright with a playful spark, now soft with a profound tenderness. She took his small, inert hand in hers, tracing the lines on his palm, murmuring something in Spanish too soft for me to discern later when Maria recounted the day to me. It was a blessing, Maria thought, or perhaps just a word of love from an abuela who saw beyond the brokenness. After a few moments, Elena sat down at the kitchen table, her movements deliberate, as if each action held a specific sacred purpose. From her worn canvas bag, a bag that always smelled faintly of lavender and old leather, she carefully extracted something wrapped in a delicately embroidered handkerchief. She unfolded the cloth with a reverence usually reserved for sacred relics, revealing a small laminated prayer card. It was faded with age and repeated handling, its corners softened, but the image was still clear. A humble friar, his face alight with an almost childlike joy, hands clasped, eyes gazing heavenward, as if caught in a moment of rapture. Below the image, the name, San Jose de Cupertino, Saint Joseph of Cupertino. This, Elena announced, her voice gentle but firm, breaking the oppressive silence that had clung to the house, is our friend now. David finally looked up from the television, a flicker of irritation in his eyes. Mama, please, he began, his voice rough. Not now. We've tried everything. Doctors, therapists, every diet, every prayer group. We don't need folklore right now. We need answers. Elena turned her gaze to her son-in-law, a look of unyielding compassion on her face. Answers, David, come from God, in His time, in His way. Doctors tell us what the body can and cannot do. But the saints remind us what God can do, even when it seems impossible. She held up the card. Do you know who this is, my son? David shook his head, looking away. Maria, however, moved closer, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and the desperate, almost instinctual desire for any hope, however thin. This is San Jose, Elena explained, her voice softening as she spoke of her chosen intercessor, Joseph of Cupertino. They called him the Flying Friar. You see, he was not like other men. From a young age he struggled. He was slow, clumsy, often misunderstood. Some called him foolish, simple-minded. He struggled even with his studies for the priesthood. But his heart was pure, and so full of God's love that when he prayed, especially during the Mass, he would often levitate. He would literally float, sometimes for hours, in ecstatic prayer, right there in front of everyone. I understood Elena's choice. Saint Joseph of Cupertino is indeed a patron saint of those with developmental disabilities, of students with learning difficulties, of those who struggle to fit into the conventional molds of the world. He was an ordinary man with an extraordinary connection to God, a connection that manifested in defiance of natural laws. Elena, with her profound and simple faith, saw in his story a parallel to Leo's own silent struggles, his inability to communicate, his physical constraints. She saw a saint who understood what it meant to be trapped in a body and mind that didn't quite conform. A saint who knew the feeling of being called foolish, and yet, through pure love, was lifted up by God himself. She looked past the medical charts and the bleak pronouncements and saw not a lost cause, but a spiritual battle waiting to be fought, a divine invitation waiting to be accepted. He struggled, like our Leo struggles, Elena continued, her eyes fixed on Maria and David. But God saw his pure heart. God lifted him up. And so, we will ask him. We will begin a novena. A novena, 9 days of focused prayer. It was a tradition deeply embedded in Catholic spirituality, a period of sustained petition, often to a specific saint, asking for their intercession for a particular intention. It was a practice Elena held dear, a rhythm of faith that had guided her through her own joys and sorrows. David scoffed, a short, bitter sound. A novena? Mama, you think a 9-day prayer to a flying friar is going to fix what the best doctors in the country can't even touch? This isn't just cruel, it's... He searched for the word, his voice rising in frustration. It's a fantasy. It's false hope. We're past hope. Maria, her face a mask of exhaustion, intervened softly. David, please. It's just prayer. What harm can it do? She looked at her mother, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Perhaps it was a faint echo of the little girl who once trusted her mother implicitly, or perhaps it was simply the complete emptiness of her own spirit, leaving no room for resistance. Harmless folklore, she would later tell me she thought, a quaint, old-fashioned comfort for her mother. Nothing more? But even a faint, harmless echo was more than David could bear. He shook his head, pushed himself up from the sofa, and retreated to his workshop in the garage, the familiar scent of sawdust a more tangible comfort than any prayer card. So it began. Every afternoon for 9 consecutive days, Elena would return. She would sit by Leo's bedside, a small crucifix clutched in her gnarled hands, and a worn rosary perpetually threaded through her fingers. The air in Leo's room, usually stagnant with the quiet hum of medical equipment, now carried the soft rhythmic murmur of Elena's prayers, and the faint, sweet scent of the blessed beeswax candles she always brought with her. She didn't just pray. She spoke. She spoke to Leo, not as if he were an invalid, but as if he were a fully sentient, beloved listener, a little prince whose language was simply different from her own. And she told him stories of Saint Joseph of Cupertino. He was a little boy like you, Leo, she would begin, her voice a soothing balm. And he found the world a very confusing place. The letters on the page danced for him, and when people spoke quickly, their words became a jumble. He often felt lonely, for others didn't understand him. But Joseph, he had a secret. He knew that God understood him. He knew that God saw into his heart, past all the struggles and the confusion, and saw only love. And when Joseph prayed, Leo, when he truly opened his heart to God, sometimes God would lift him up, not just in spirit, but physically. He would float, like a little bird, higher and higher, sometimes reaching the very ceiling of the church, his face shining with pure joy. Imagine that, Leo. Just imagine being so full of God's love that you could float right up to him. She would describe these levitations with vivid, almost cinematic detail, painting pictures with her words for the boy, whose eyes often seemed to hold no light. She spoke of the awe and fear of the onlookers, the confusion of the bishops, but always, she emphasized the love. That was at the core of St. Joseph's mysticism. It wasn't about power or spectacle, but about an uncontainable joy. A soul so intoxicated by God's presence that the laws of gravity simply ceased to apply. And they called him a fool, Leo, she'd whisper, stroking his hair. But he was no fool. He was wise in the ways of heaven. He knew that our minds, our bodies, they are just vessels. What truly matters is the soul, the spark of God within us. And sometimes, Leo, when we offer our struggles, our confusion, our very selves to God, He can do things we never dreamed possible. He can make the weak strong, the silent speak, the earthbound fly. As the days of the novena unfolded, I continued my regular pastoral visits to the Martinez home. Each time I felt the subtle shift in the atmosphere. David remained resolutely aloof, often disappearing to his workshop when Elena arrived, emerging only for supper, his face grim, his silence heavy with a quiet resentment. He saw his mother-in-law's fervent prayers not as an act of love, but as an affront to his own shattered faith, a denial of the brutal reality that had claimed his son. He found her persistent hope to be cruel, because it dared to suggest a different outcome where he had long since accepted defeat. Maria, however, began to change. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the mask of grief on her face began to soften, if only at the edges. She still believed it was harmless folklore, perhaps, but she allowed herself to sit and listen as Elena recounted the saint's stories. She watched her mother with Leo, witnessed the quiet devotion, the unwavering belief in a love that transcended understanding. Desperation, I've found, can be a fertile ground for faith, even when that faith begins as nothing more than a faint whisper in a dark room. Maria didn't join in the prayers with the same fervor as Elena, but she didn't object either. She would sometimes simply sit on Leo's bed, holding his other hand, listening to her mother's voice fill the room, a voice that spoke not of medical reports or inevitable decline, but of a God who could lift men into the air. And Leo, Leo, he remained, to all outward appearances, the same, mute, crippled, often listless. But sometimes, Maria swore, as Elena spoke of St. Joseph soaring heavenward, a faint light would flicker in Leo's eyes, a momentary spark of awareness. Once, Elena told me as she described the saint's ecstatic joy, Leo's inert hand, resting in hers, seemed to give the faintest squeeze. It might have been nothing, a muscle spasm, a phantom sensation. But to Elena it was a response, a sign that the seed of hope, watered by prayer and nurtured by faith, was indeed beginning to take root, even in the silent, hidden garden of her grandson's soul. During my visits I would offer quiet prayers with Elena and Maria. I would bless Leo, tracing the sign of the cross on his forehead, my heart aching for this family, for this boy. I admired Elena's faith, a robust and simple trust that shamed my own sometimes overly intellectualized approach. I knew the theology of suffering, the doctrines of divine providence, but Elena simply lived them. She didn't seek to understand why God allowed suffering. She sought to understand how God would respond to it. Her novena wasn't a demand, but an earnest, loving plea. An invitation for God to reveal His merciful power in His own wondrous way, through the intercession of His saint. As the 9th day approached, the days growing shorter and the air taking on a crispness that hinted at autumn, the tension in the Martinez home became almost unbearable. Maria's quiet, tentative hope was still fragile, overshadowed by the ever-present shadow of Leo's worsening condition. David's resentment had deepened, becoming a hard, bitter core within him. Even I, the priest, found myself wrestling with a familiar despair. Would this novena, this 9-day torrent of simple, profound faith, yield anything more than a renewed ache, a fresh disappointment for a family already beyond endurance? Leo was still trapped, still silent, still fading. The medical timeline I knew was closing in. The world, in its cold, rational wisdom, offered no solution. And yet, Elena's worn prayer card, the image of the flying friar, seemed to hum with a silent, insistent promise, a testament to a hope that refused to be extinguished, even in the face of absolute, crushing despair. The stage was set, though we didn't know it, for the darkest hour, and perhaps for an answer beyond all earthly understanding. The stage had been set, indeed, for the darkest hour, though none of us could have known just how profoundly the shadows would gather before the light. The memory of Elena's novena, her steadfast, almost childlike faith, still glows dimly in my mind, a solitary candle flickering against the encroaching night. But on that 8th day, as the final medical appointment loomed, that candle seemed destined to be snuffed out by a gale of despair that swept through the Martinez home, and indeed, through my own heart. I remember the morning of that 8th day with a particular clarity, etched as it is into the landscape of my soul. A raw, unforgiving wind had whipped through our little town, stripping the last defiant leaves from the oaks and rattling the windows of my rectory. It felt like a premonition, a physical manifestation of the chill that had begun to settle deep within me. My prayers for Leo had grown increasingly urgent, less a plea for healing, and more a desperate cry for strength for his parents, for peace in whatever lay ahead. I had learned, over my many years as a priest, that sometimes the miracle isn't the cure, but the grace to endure. Yet, with Leo, even that grace seemed tragically elusive, swallowed by the sheer, relentless cruelty of his condition. The appointment was at a specialist's office in the city, a place of hushed corridors and the faint antiseptic scent of clinical detachment. Maria had called me the night before, her voice thin and reedy, asking if I might be there, not for Leo, she'd said, but for them. Just to sit, Father Michael. she'd whispered, to be a presence. And so I went, a silent shepherd accompanying his flock into what I feared would be a valley of shadows. I found them in the sterile waiting room, an island of quiet agony amidst the muted hum of a modern medical facility. David sat rigidly, his large carpenter's hands, usually so active, now clasped together so tightly his knuckles were white. His jaw was set, a muscle ticking rhythmically in his temple, a testament to the internal storm raging within him. He offered me a terse nod. His eyes, usually so honest and open, now veiled by a profound, weary anger. Maria sat beside him, her small frame seeming even smaller, her shoulders hunched as if trying to physically contain the anxiety that radiated from her. She held Leo in her lap, his head lolling against her shoulder, his eyes wide and unseeing, staring into the middle distance, a familiar vacant gaze that spoke volumes of his detachment, his perpetual otherworldliness. He was, as always, utterly silent, his presence a poignant, fragile accusation in a room full of murmurs. I took a seat across from them, offering a small, silent prayer for courage for us all. The waiting was interminable, each tick of the wall clock a hammer blow against their already brittle resolve. I watched Maria absent-mindedly stroke Leo's sparse hair, a gesture of profound love that carried the crushing weight of unspoken fear. I could feel the spiritual tension in the room, thick and suffocating. This was not just a medical consultation, it was a reckoning. Finally, a nurse with a kindly but somber expression called Leo's name. We followed her down a fluorescent-lit corridor, the air growing heavier with each step, until we reached a consultation room that felt less like a place of healing and more like a tribunal. Dr. Eleanor Vance, a pediatric neurologist renowned for her brilliant mind and, ironically, her gentle compassion, sat behind a polished desk, her hands folded, her face a canvas of professional solemnity and genuine regret. She began, as doctors often do, with an explanation of the tests, the latest scans, the physiological markers. Her voice was soft, measured, but each word was a pebble dropped into the still, dark pool of their hopes, sending ripples of dread. I watched David's jaw clench tighter with every technical term. Maria's gaze fixed on the doctor's lips as if clinging to every syllable, searching for a lifeline. Leo, oblivious, continued to stare blankly ahead, a silent sentinel to his own unfolding tragedy. David, Maria, Dr. Vance began, her voice softening further. We've reviewed all the latest findings. Leo's condition, as you know, is exceptionally aggressive, and I'm afraid the progression has accelerated. The air left the room. Maria gasped, a small choked sound. David remained stone-faced, but I saw the faint tremor in his hands, the sudden fierce clenching of his jaw. Dr. Vance continued, her eyes holding Maria's. His muscular dystrophy, it's now significantly impacting his autonomic functions. We're seeing early signs of organ compromise. His respiratory function is decreasing, his cardiac output is weakening, his kidneys are showing strain. Each phrase was a fresh wound. Organ compromise, respiratory function decreasing. These weren't just clinical terms, they were death knells, ringing with cold, irrefutable finality. David leaned forward slightly, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. What does that mean, doctor? In plain English, Dr. Vance met his gaze, her compassion warring with the harsh truth she had to deliver. It means, David, that the disease is no longer confined to his voluntary muscles. It's attacking the very systems that keep him alive. The timeline we discussed previously, years, perhaps a few years, that has unfortunately changed. She paused, took a breath, and then delivered the hammer blow that shattered whatever remaining illusions of hope we harbored. We are now looking at months, potentially weeks. The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Months, weeks, not years, not a distant abstract future, but a brutal immediate present. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach, a familiar ache of helplessness. Maria's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a sob. Tears welled in her eyes, silent and swift, tracing paths down her pale cheeks. David pushed back from the desk, his chair scraping loudly on the linoleum floor. His face was a mask of utter devastation, his eyes momentarily stripped of anger, revealing a raw, inconsolable grief. Dr. Vance, ever the professional, tried to soften the blow with the language of comfort that medicine could offer. At this point, our focus shifts. We are no longer talking about curative measures. It's about quality of life, about ensuring Leo is as comfortable as possible, free from pain, surrounded by love. We recommend transitioning to a comprehensive palliative care program. It's about managing symptoms, maximizing comfort, and supporting you both through this profoundly difficult time. Palliative care, quality of life. These phrases, meant to be gentle, felt like an admission of defeat, a surrender to the inevitable. For David and Maria, they were the official pronouncement that there was no more fight to be had, no more hope to cling to. It was the formal acceptance of a slow, agonizing farewell. Maria finally found her voice, a broken whisper. But the novena, Father Michael, Elena's prayers, Saint Joseph of Cupertino. Her gaze pleaded with me, searching for an answer I couldn't give. What could I say in the face of such absolute, crushing medical certainty? My theology, my gentle words of faith and divine mystery, felt like pebbles against a tidal wave. I reached out and placed a hand on Maria's trembling arm, a gesture of silent solidarity. "Maria," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "God's ways are not always ours to understand, but His love—" My words trailed off, hollow, even to my own ears. In that moment, even I struggled to reconcile God's boundless love with the brutal reality of Leo's suffering. David, however, was past words. He stood abruptly, his chair toppling backward with a clatter that echoed sharply in the small room. "God's love!" he barked, his voice laced with an acid bitterness that made me flinch. "What love is this, Father? What kind of God watches a child waste away day by day, year by year, and then gives us months? Weeks? Is that His love? Or His cruelty?" He didn't wait for an answer. He scooped up Leo, not gently but with a desperate, almost violent protectiveness, and strode out of the room, leaving a stunned Maria and a deeply saddened Dr. Vance in his wake. We followed him in silence, the weight of the diagnosis pressing down on us like a physical force. The ride home was a blur of unshed tears for Maria and a simmering, dangerous fury for David. Leo remained oblivious in the back seat, his fragile presence a silent accusation that deepened the chasm between his parents. There was no conversation, no comforting words exchanged, only the growl of David's truck engine, a mechanical dirge accompanying their journey into profound despair. The air in the Martinez home that evening was not just quiet, it was dead. It was the suffocating silence of absolute despair, a profound emptiness that swallowed every sound, every unspoken thought. The setting sun, usually a source of golden warmth, cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to mock the vibrant life that had once pulsed within those walls. The kitchen, usually smelling of Maria's cooking, hung heavy with the scent of unspoken grief and stagnant air. Maria moved like a ghost, her face pale and drawn, her eyes swollen from weeping. She put Leo to bed, a ritual now steeped in heart-wrenching finality. Each tuck of the blanket, each kiss on his forehead, a silent farewell. I imagine she whispered prayers, but they would have been prayers of pure anguish, bereft of hope, desperate bargains whispered into the dark. Not for a miracle, but perhaps for mercy, for an end to the unbearable pain. Her novena, now on its 8th day, felt not like a hopeful petition but a cruel deception, a testament to a faith that had, in the face of such overwhelming evidence, crumbled into dust. David, meanwhile, was a storm of contained fury. He stalked through the house, his heavy footsteps echoing hollowly, each stride radiating a palpable resentment that seemed to poison the very air. His large, capable hands, the hands that could build an entire life, now hung uselessly at his sides, clenched into tight fists. He looked at the photographs on the mantelpiece, Leo as a healthy infant, smiling, full of promise, and then at the living, breathing, fading boy in the next room, and his heart curdled with a bitter question. Why? Why them? Why Leo? I had called their home, tentatively, in the early evening, but Maria's voice had been a barely audible whisper, telling me they just needed to be alone. I understood. There are moments when even the comforting presence of a priest feels like an intrusion, when grief is so raw it demands isolation. But I could feel their pain, a spiritual vibration across the distance, a profound emptiness that resonated with my own priestly heart. It happened later that night, in the darkest hour, when the world outside was asleep and the house was swallowed by an oppressive quiet. I only learned the details from Maria days later, her voice still trembling with the memory. David had been sitting in the living room, the room where they had celebrated birthdays, shared laughter, and knelt in prayer. His gaze fell upon the crucifix hanging prominently on the wall, a simple wooden cross with a humble corpus, a gift from their wedding day. For years it had been a source of comfort, a reminder of Christ's suffering and ultimate triumph, a symbol of their faith, a silent witness to their joys and sorrows. But on this night, it represented something else entirely. It represented a God who had betrayed them, a God who had turned his back on their child, a God who was either powerless or, worse, profoundly uncaring. His grief, long suppressed, festered into a molten rage. He saw the crucifix not as a symbol of hope, but of a false promise, a cruel mockery of their desperate prayers. He stood up, his movements jerky and uncontrolled, and walked towards the wall. Maria, who had been sitting quietly on the sofa, her own spirit crushed, looked up, a silent question in her tear-filled eyes. David reached out, his hand grasping the edge of the wooden cross. His voice, when it came, was not the gentle tone of a father or a husband, but a guttural roar, ripped from the deepest well of his tormented soul. Is this it? He bellowed, his voice echoing unnaturally in the silent house, startling Maria, causing her to flinch. This is your love, your plan, to watch a boy suffer, to slowly take him from us piece by piece and then offer us months? His voice cracked with unspeakable pain. Where have you been, God? Where have you been all these years? When we begged you, when we prayed, when we sacrificed, where is the mercy? Where is the compassion? His words were not just questions. They were accusations, hurled at a silent heaven. He tugged at the crucifix, his hands trembling with a mixture of rage and profound sorrow. The nails groaned in the plaster, protesting the violence. "You're a tyrant!" he screamed, his voice raw and hoarse, tears streaming down his face, tears of pure, unadulterated agony. A cruel, uncaring tyrant. Or you're not there at all. You're not there. None of it is real. With a final desperate heave, fueled by an inferno of grief and betrayal, David ripped the crucifix from the wall. The sound of splintering wood, cracking plaster, and the heavy thud of the cross hitting the floor shattered the profound silence of their home, a violent punctuation mark on the end of their faith. The image of Christ, once a beacon of hope, now lay broken on the rug, a symbol of David's own shattered belief. Maria watched, paralyzed, her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to argue, to defend her God, to plead with David, but the words died on her lips. Her own faith, already weakened by years of unanswered prayers, and the relentless march of Leo's disease, now crumbled into dust. The sight of the fallen crucifix, the sound of David's heartbroken screams, extinguished the last flickering ember of her hope. She could not argue because, in that moment, she felt the crushing truth of David's despair. Her God, too, felt absent, silent, and terribly, terribly distant. The silence that followed David's outburst was not the familiar quiet of their home, the gentle hush that Leo's condition had imposed. This was a deeper, more profound silence, an echoing void where faith had once resided. It was the suffocating silence of absolute despair, the feeling of a prayer utterly and finally unanswered. It was the silence of a home that had lost not just a child, but its spiritual moorings, its very foundation. David stood over the broken crucifix, his chest heaving, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He had raged, he had accused, he had destroyed, and now, nothing was left but a devastating emptiness. Maria, curled on the sofa, wept silently, her tears mingling with the bitter residue of shattered belief. Leo, sleeping peacefully in his room, was unaware of the spiritual cataclysm that had engulfed his family, his innocence a heartbreaking contrast to the destruction outside his door. And I, though not present, felt the ripple of that cataclysm. I felt the spiritual wound open in the heart of my parish, in the heart of that family. My prayers, offered in the quiet solitude of my rectory, now felt hollow, inadequate. How does one minister to a despair so absolute that it rips Christ from the wall? What words of comfort can one offer when God himself is accused of tyranny or non-existence? In that darkest hour, on the eve of the 9th and final day of Elena's novena, all earthly hope had vanished. Medicine offered only palliative care, love offered only a slower farewell, and faith for David and Maria had offered only silence. The stage was not just set for a miracle, it was crying out for one, a desperate, silent plea for divine intervention in a world that had become utterly, terrifyingly hopeless. The only answer left was one that had to transcend all human understanding, all scientific explanation, all the crushing weight of ordinary reality. The only answer left had to be from heaven itself. The early morning air of the 9th day of Elena's novena was heavy with a mist that clung to the windows of the rectory, blurring the edges of the world as if even creation itself wept. Yet, through that veil, a faint, resolute light began to break, a pale promise on the eastern horizon. It was into this hesitant dawn that Elena arrived at the Martinez home, her worn rosary beads clutched in hands gnarled by a lifetime of toil and prayer. She moved with a quiet dignity, her steps unhurried. Her face, though lined with concern, held an underlying serenity that belied the storm of the previous night. I imagined her, walking the familiar path from her small cottage, the scent of damp earth rising to meet her, the world slowly awakening around her, while the Martinez house remained shrouded in a deeper, colder night. She did not carry a new prayer card or a fresh saint's medal. Her offering this morning was far more profound, far more costly. She found Maria in the kitchen, staring blankly into a cup of cooling tea, her silhouette against the dim light, a figure of profound desolation. The wreckage of David's despair from the night before was still visible in the living room, the gaping emptiness on the wall where the crucifix had hung, a few splinters of plaster on the floor like fallen tears. Maria's grief, I knew, had moved past the stage of tears. It was a dry, hollow ache, a cavern carved out by years of watching her son fade, now amplified by the stark finality of the doctor's words. Her spirit, once vibrant with maternal hope, now seemed to possess the brittle transparency of a spider's silk, ready to fray at the slightest touch. Elena did not speak of St. Joseph of Cupertino, or of flying friars, or of any earthly cure. She simply sat beside Maria, taking her hand, a hand that felt cold and lifeless, like a marble statue. Her voice, when it came, was a soft murmur, like the gentle lapping of water on a distant shore, contrasting sharply with the shrill cries of despair that had echoed through those walls hours before. "Maria," she began, her eyes, ancient and wise, meeting her daughter-in-law's dulled gaze. "Today is the last day of the novena. I ask you, my dear, to bring Leo to Mass, one last time." Maria stirred, a faint flicker of pain crossing her face, as if the mere mention of ritual felt like a fresh wound. "For what, Elena?" Her voice was a rasp, barely audible. "What good will it do? The doctors, God, they have all abandoned us. We prayed, Elena. Oh, how we prayed. And look at him. Look at what is left." She gestured vaguely towards the back of the house, where Leo lay, a silent, fragile testament to a faith that felt utterly betrayed. "Not for a cure, Maria," Elena said gently, her grip on Maria's hand firm, anchoring, not as a bargain or a plea for a specific answer, but as an act of surrender, a true surrender, to lay it all down, my child, to offer your suffering, and Leo's, not in anger or in demand, but in quiet trust, to let go of what we think God should do, and simply place ourselves, broken and empty, before Him, to say, "Your will, Lord, be done," not because we understand it, but because we trust the one who wills it. It was a staggering request, an invitation to a precipice from which Maria felt she had nothing left to fall. The very concept of surrender had become synonymous with defeat in her lexicon of pain. For years she had fought the disease, fought for answers, fought to keep her faith alive against the relentless tide of Leo's decline. To surrender now felt like abandoning her son, abandoning the last sliver of hope she had unknowingly clung to, even as she claimed to have none. Yet Elena's quiet conviction, devoid of any preachiness, held a strange, magnetic power. It wasn't the force of an argument, but the quiet, unshakable strength of a soul steeped in prayer, one who understood that the deepest mysteries are often found not in answers, but in abandonment to a greater love. Maria looked at the empty space on the wall again, then at the rosary clutched in Elena's hand. She saw the truth of her mother-in-law's words. What was there left to lose? Every avenue of human intervention had been exhausted. Every desperate prayer for a specific outcome had, to her perception, gone unanswered. Her faith was not just crumbling, it had already collapsed into a pile of indistinguishable dust. There was no hope left to be dashed, no expectation left to be unmet. This was not hope, but sheer, profound exhaustion, a weary inclination towards a final ritual, perhaps to mark the end of their long, drawn-out battle. "And David," Maria whispered, her voice like sandpaper. Elena sighed, a sound laden with her own quiet sorrow for her son. David, I knew, had spent the night in the grim solitude of his workshop, the rhythmic clang of his hammer echoing through the house not in creation, but in a furious, futile attempt to drown out his grief. He would be shaping metal, perhaps, or sawing wood, bending physical things to his will in a desperate effort to regain control over a life that felt utterly out of control. The workshop, once a place of pride and purpose, where his strong hands crafted beauty and function, had become his fortress of despair, a self-imposed prison against the unbearable reality of his son's suffering and his God's perceived silence. Elena knew it was useless to approach him. His pain was too raw, too volatile. "David needs his own time, my dear," she said, her voice laced with understanding rather than judgment. "He will find his way, or be found. We must simply do what we can, with what little strength we have left." And so, with nothing left to lose but the fragile remnants of her pride and the last vestiges of a will to fight, a hollowed-out Maria agreed. She moved through the house in a daze, like a sleepwalker, preparing Leo for Mass. Each movement was deliberate, yet devoid of purpose. The act of dressing his small, atrophied limbs, once a source of aching tenderness, was now a mechanical function, a final offering to a God she no longer understood, perhaps no longer believed in. Leo lay in his bed. His eyes, usually wide and unfocused, now seemed even more distant, more shuttered. He was listless, a feather adrift on a shoreless sea, his small chest barely rising and falling with each shallow breath. The silence that had always surrounded him now felt heavier, a shroud. Maria tried to find some flicker of connection, some sign of awareness in his gaze, but found only the familiar, heartbreaking vacancy. It was as if his spirit too had begun to recede. Preparing for a departure she could feel in her bones. Elena, ever present, helped her with the small, difficult tasks. Her silent assistance a balm to Maria's broken spirit. They set out for church a little earlier than usual, the morning chill still biting. Maria pushed Leo's wheelchair, its familiar squeak a sad accompaniment to the silence between them. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant cry of a bird. The weight of the wheelchair, with Leo's frail body slumped within it, felt immense, a tangible burden of grief she had carried for so long. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the few early risers they passed, her gaze fixed on the uneven pavement ahead, each turn of the wheel an act of sheer will. Elena walked beside them, her posture straight, her eyes fixed on the distant steeple of St. Michael's, a beacon of hope she clung to with unwavering faith. I was in the sacristy, preparing for the morning mass, my heart a heavy stone within my chest. The previous night's conversation with Elena had been brief but telling. She hadn't gone into details about David's outburst, but her quiet sorrow spoke volumes. The image of the torn-down crucifix lingered in my mind, a stark symbol of faith fractured. How does one stand at the altar, a vessel of Christ's body and blood, when the very foundations of belief have been shaken so violently in the lives of his flock? My own prayers that morning felt like leaden weights, struggling to lift towards heaven. I had envisioned the Mass today as a somber affair, a communal act of lamentation for the Martinez family, and indeed for all who wrestled with the unbearable mystery of suffering. As the first parishioners began to trickle in, a hush fell over the church that was different from the usual pre-Mass reverence. It was a weighted silence, imbued with a collective sadness. Everyone knew about Leo, of course. He was a constant presence in the third pew, a living, breathing question mark to the goodness of God. But the news from the specialist, whispered through the parish grapevines, had transformed that question mark into an exclamation point of sorrow. There was a palpable atmosphere of shared grief, a quiet acknowledgement of the family's impending, agonizing loss. Then I saw them, Maria and Elena pushing Leo's small wheelchair down the central aisle. The soft light filtering through the stained glass windows, usually vibrant and full of promise, seemed muted today, casting long, somber shadows. Maria's face was indeed a mask of grief, drawn and pale, her eyes sunken, reflecting a profound weariness that went beyond mere physical exhaustion. She moved with a stiff, almost robotic gait, her focus unwavering as she steered Leo towards their customary spot in the third pew, directly beneath the majestic crucifix that hung above the altar. And Leo, oh little Leo! He was slumped listlessly in his chair, his head lolling gently, his thin frame swallowed by the padded seat. His limbs, usually so taut and twisted, seemed particularly limp today, almost deflated. His eyes, typically wide and unseeing, were now half closed, as if even the effort of maintaining consciousness was too great. He seemed utterly unaware of his surroundings, a tiny, fragile shell devoid of its animating spirit. The sight of him, so utterly broken and vulnerable, sent a fresh wave of sorrow through the pews. I saw heads bow, hands instinctively reach for rosaries, and the quiet murmurs of pity and prayer ripple through the congregation. It was a silent gasp of collective despair. My own throat tightened, and I felt a prickle of tears behind my eyes. How could I offer hope to these dear people, to Maria and Elena, when all that lay before us seemed to be the bleak landscape of an undeniable, irreversible end? I began the Mass, my voice, I hoped, steady, though my heart was anything but. The opening prayers felt particularly poignant, words of comfort and divine mercy taking on a desperate urgency. My homily, planned around the profound and often inscrutable mystery of suffering, felt heavy on my tongue. I had intended to speak of God's mysterious ways, of the redemptive power of pain offered up to Christ, of finding solace in his unwavering love even in the darkest valleys. I had practiced passages from Job, from the Psalms, words that had so often provided comfort in the face of incomprehensible grief. But now, as I looked out at Maria's hollowed face, at Leo's inert form, at the collective sorrow etched on the faces of my parishioners, those carefully chosen words felt like pebbles against a tidal wave. They were inadequate, impotent. How could I speak of suffering's purpose when the suffering itself seemed so utterly meaningless, so cruelly prolonged? How could I offer comfort to a family and a parish that felt utterly abandoned by the very God I was called to serve? The air in the church was thick with unspoken questions, with shared anxieties, with the quiet lament of souls burdened by the unyielding realities of life and death. The candles on the altar flickered, their flames tiny, defiant pinpricks against the vastness of human grief. I moved through the liturgy, each gesture, each word, a mechanical act, my soul wrestling with a profound sense of inadequacy, a quiet desperation. The stage, I realized, was not merely set for a miracle. Nor was it simply crying out for one. It was a void, an emptiness so absolute, so devoid of all earthly hope, that it had become a space perfectly prepared for heaven itself to descend, to fill the unbearable silence with a sound that could only come from beyond the veil. This Mass was not an appeal. It was a final, fragile act of surrender, a laying down of all expectations, a desperate plea for something, anything, to break the suffocating silence. The Mass continued, each prayer a small, desperate breath drawn in the presence of an immense, suffocating silence. It was a quiet that pressed in from every direction, not the hallowed stillness of profound devotion, but a heavy, empty hush that carried the collective weight of unspoken grief and exhausted hope. The very air in the sanctuary felt thick, laden with the sorrow that had become so intimately woven into the fabric of our parish life. My homily, which I had prepared with such painstaking care, intending to offer solace in suffering, felt like a hollow echo, barely reaching beyond the altar rail in the vastness of that unanswerable grief. I remember the sound of my own voice, perhaps a little too soft, a little too weary, attempting to articulate the inscrutable wisdom of the cross. I had spoken of Job, of his unwavering faith amidst unimaginable loss, his anguished questions, and God's eventual awe-inspiring reply. I had tried to paint a picture of Christ in Gethsemane, sweating blood, wrestling with his own human fear and sorrow, accepting a cup he wished to pass. I spoke of the cross not merely as an instrument of torture, but as a profound, terrifying mystery, a wound that often felt like it had no salve, no earthly comfort that could truly heal its depth. But even as the carefully chosen words left my lips, shaped by years of theological study and pastoral experience, I felt their profound inadequacy, their utter impotence in the face of the raw, visceral pain that permeated the church. They were just words, frail vessels against an ocean of sorrow. Maria sat in the third pew, a figure carved from pure grief, a statue of sorrow beside the small, inert form of her son, Leo. Her shoulders were slumped, a palpable weight pressing them down, and her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, seemed to be holding on to the last vestiges of her strength. Her face, usually so vibrant, was now a pale, drawn mask, eyes downcast, betraying no flicker of emotion beyond a profound weariness. Leo, oblivious in his wheelchair, his head slumped to one side, was a portrait of heartbreaking fragility, his breathing shallow, barely disturbing the stillness around him. I could see the almost translucent quality of his skin, the delicate pulse visible at his temple, a constant, quiet reminder of the tenuous hold he had on this earthly life. The congregation, a sea of familiar faces, reflected her pain back to me like a fractured mirror. Resignation was etched into every brow, a quiet yearning for a hope that felt long extinguished, replaced by a dull ache of acceptance. I saw Mrs. Rodriguez, her eyes red-rimmed, remembering perhaps her own child lost too soon. I saw Mr. Henderson, a man known for his booming laugh, now with his head bowed, his jovial spirit subdued into a silent prayer. Each person carried their own understanding of Maria's anguish, a shared burden of empathy and despair. A palpable sense of waiting had settled over them, not for salvation or revelation, but for the inevitable, for the quiet end to a long, drawn-out suffering. We moved towards the liturgy of the Eucharist, the sacred heart of our worship, the very source and summit of our faith. My hands, usually steady and practiced after decades of ritual, felt heavy, leaden with the responsibility of preparing the altar. I arranged the paten, its silver gleaming dully, and the chalice, a vessel soon to hold the blood of Christ. Each movement felt deliberate, almost ponderous, as if through these simple familiar gestures, I was attempting to anchor us, however briefly, in the ancient unchanging rhythm of faith. The scent of incense from earlier in the service still hung faintly in the air, a ghostly presence of prayer, a wispy memory of hope, mingling now with the metallic tang of unspoken despair, a bitter undertone to the sacred perfume. As I began the words of the consecration, my voice, which had faltered during the homily, found a surprising strength, a resonance born of duty, and yes, a last, fragile petition. I felt the immense weight of them, not just as liturgy, as a ritual passed down through generations, but as a desperate plea, a final offering to a God whose silence had, until now, felt absolute. Take this, all of you, and eat of it, for this is my body. My gaze was fixed upon the host, the simple disk of unleavened bread, soon to become the living presence of our Lord, and I poured every ounce of my dwindling faith into those words, those sacred, transformative syllables. As I extended my hands over the bread, pronouncing the words that have echoed through 2 millennia, a profound shift began. It wasn't immediately perceptible, not a sound or a visible alteration in the dim, familiar light filtering through the stained glass windows, but a fundamental change, a profound alteration in the very fabric of the air around me. It was as if the atmosphere in the church, usually heavy with the aggregated sorrows of its congregants, with the dust of ages and the weight of human sighs, suddenly thinned, becoming incredibly light, almost ethereal, as if a great, invisible curtain had been drawn back, revealing a space previously veiled. Then, a warmth began to spread, not the familiar warmth of the early morning sun breaking through the leaded panes, nor the comforting glow of a radiator, but an internal heat. It seemed to emanate not from any physical source, but from the altar itself, from the very host held in my trembling hands. This warmth was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It didn't just touch the skin, it seemed to permeate it, sinking deep into the very core of my being. A gentle, caressing presence that was both profoundly comforting and deeply unsettling. It hummed, a silent, resonant vibration that I felt deep in my bones, a living, resonant frequency of grace, a melody only the spirit could hear, promising something vast and uncontainable. This sensation was so utterly alien, so utterly divine, that it challenged my very understanding of reality, forcing me to question the boundaries of the possible. My eyes, usually fixed upon the host in deep reverence during this most sacred moment, flickered, drawn by an instinct I couldn't name, a pull so compelling it felt almost physical. It was a momentary distraction, a subtle, almost magnetic tug that felt utterly alien to the absolute, unwavering focus demanded by the consecration. To break my gaze, even for an instant, felt like a sacrilege in itself, a deviation from decades of practiced devotion. But it was enough. The pull was too strong to resist, a whisper louder than any shout. Out of the corner of my eye I saw it, or rather, felt it before I saw it clearly, a disturbance in the previously still air, a ripple in the quiet desperation, a movement in the third pew. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a cough or a fidget or the shifting weight of a tired child. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible tremor, a barely there disturbance, then a slow, deliberate unfolding. Leo. The name echoed in my mind, a desperate prayer and a stark fear intertwined. My heart seized, a cold dread mixing inexplicably with the peculiar warmth that still enveloped the sanctuary. 1,000 possibilities, each more terrifying than the last, flashed through my mind. Was he having a seizure? Perhaps his last? Was this the final, terrible decline that the doctors had warned about, manifesting here in the very heart of the Mass? My mind raced, trying to reconcile the sacred moment of consecration with the potential medical emergency unfolding just beyond my direct line of sight. My pastoral duties clamored for attention, urging me to break the ritual, to go to him, to administer whatever comfort I could. Yet I remained frozen, my hands still aloft, the host between my fingers, caught between two impossibilities. But it was not a seizure, it was not a struggle, it was an ascent. As I held the consecrated host aloft, a silent, radiant beacon against the familiar, somber backdrop of the large wooden crucifix above the altar, Leo Martinez rose, not with the strained, jerky, agonizing movements that had characterized every attempt at mobility in his broken body, but with an impossible, breathtaking grace, an effortless fluidity that defied every law of physics, every medical report, every specialist's prognosis. He did not push himself up. He simply unmoored. His small form, usually slumped and listless in the wheelchair, which now seemed almost too small for him, straightened with an impossible fluid elegance. It was as if a hidden sculptor had passed a loving hand over him, realigning every bone, every muscle. His legs, once cruelly twisted and contorted by disease, gently elongated, aligning with a perfect symmetry, as if drawn upwards by an invisible thread of pure light. His feet, tiny and childlike, lifted effortlessly from the footrests of his chair, clearing them with a silent grace, then clearing the top of the pew back with an effortless, buoyant lift. He floated. The word sounds fantastical, perhaps even hyperbolic, conjuring images from myth or legend. But I assure you, my dear friend, it is the only accurate descriptor. He floated, weightless, suspended in the space above his wheelchair, his body now perfectly vertical, aligned, his head held high, his gaze unwavering. It was not a violent expulsion from his earthly bonds, not an abrupt, jarring defiance of gravity, but a gentle spiritual levitation, a slow, majestic rise, as if he were being lifted by unseen hands, welcomed into an unseen embrace. He seemed utterly at peace, utterly serene, defying the very laws that had shackled him for so long. The air around him seemed to shimmer, a soft, almost imperceptible luminescence outlining his fragile form, a faint golden aura that spoke not of earthly light, but of something truly divine. It was as if the boundary between the sacred and the mundane had dissolved, and a piece of heaven had descended, manifesting around this small, vulnerable boy. His hands, those small, often clenched or spastic hands that had never known the freedom of intentional movement, unfurled. They opened slowly, palms upwards, a gesture of absolute receptivity, of childlike surrender, a silent offering. They were no longer the hands of a boy trapped, imprisoned within his own failing flesh, but the hands of one prepared to receive, open to a grace that was now undeniably present. And his face, once a mask of mute suffering, of vacant disinterest, was utterly transformed. The vacant stare, the clouded intelligence, the heavy burden of his illness, all were gone. In their place was a serene, luminous clarity, a gentle radiance that seemed to emanate from within. His eyes, fixed with an intensity I had never witnessed, an intelligence that had previously only been a whispered hope, were not on me, the officiating priest, nor on his distraught mother in the pew below, but directly on the crucifix above the altar. Then, perhaps, on the host I held, though in my shock, I could not be absolutely sure. They shone, those eyes, with a light that seemed to encompass not just understanding, but profound, joyous recognition, a wisdom far beyond his years, far beyond his known capacity. They were the eyes of a soul suddenly unfettered, seeing the world, and indeed heaven, with pristine clarity for the very first time. The church, moments before filled with the hushed rustle of parishioners shifting in their seats, the faint creak of ancient pews, the stifled sniffles of a grieving mother, fell into an absolute, profound silence. It was a silence unlike any I had ever known, not the reverent quiet of prayer, or the expectant hush of a sacred moment, but the breathless, stunned stillness of a world suddenly turned on its head. Every eye, I knew without seeing them, was transfixed, wide with disbelief and awe. Every soul was frozen, suspended in a moment of pure, unadulterated wonder, held captive by the impossible reality unfolding before them. I could feel their collective gasp, a silent implosion of disbelief that reverberated through the very stones of the church. It was as if time itself had ceased to flow, holding us all captive in the crucible of the impossible, witnessing a truth so profound it shattered all previous understanding. And I, the priest, the instrument of Christ, stood there, my hand still raised, the sacred host poised between heaven and earth, a fragile bridge between two realities. My eyes, too, were drawn irrevocably to Leo, to the small levitating boy who was defying every law of nature I had ever known, every medical truth I had ever heard, every limitation human science had placed upon him. The warmth in the sanctuary intensified, enveloping me wholly, a feeling of pure, unadulterated divine presence, a tangible manifestation of God's limitless power and infinite mercy. It was beautiful, terrifying, and utterly overwhelming, a sensation that threatened to unravel the very fabric of my ordered priestly existence. In that instant, the weight of the world, the cumulative weight of every unfulfilled prayer I had ever offered, every unanswered question about suffering that had ever gnawed at my faith, converged in my trembling hand. The small white disk of the consecrated host, the body of Christ himself, the very real presence of God, suddenly felt heavier than lead, impossible to hold. My fingers, usually so accustomed to its light, ethereal touch, convulsed, no longer under my command. My hand, which had offered comfort, blessed the dying, and held the sacred mysteries for decades with unwavering steadiness, betrayed me, succumbing to the seismic shock of the divine. It trembled, violently, uncontrollably, a physical manifestation of my own inner turmoil and utter powerlessness. And then it slipped. The body of Christ, the very presence of God, slid from my grasp. I watched, in slow-motion horror, as it arced gracefully, impossibly, through the incense-laden air. It didn't fall to the cold, hard floor with a thud, which would have been sacrilege enough, an unspeakable violation, but drifted, almost reluctantly with a curious, buoyant gentleness, descending towards the altar cloth. It came to rest not on the hard marble, which would have felt like a judgment, but gently, softly, almost reverently, on the embroidered linen, a quiet, almost tender landing. The entire church remained motionless, a tableau of disbelief, a collection of souls petrified in the face of the miraculous. No one spoke, no one moved, not a whisper, not a stir. The only sound was the frantic beating of my own heart, a thunderous drumbeat echoing in my ears, a primal rhythm against the profound, terrifying silence of a miracle. My mind, reeling, grappled desperately with the enormity of what I had just witnessed, and with the unspeakable thing I had just done. A sacrilege. A profound failure in the face of the divine, a lapse in duty that shook me to my core. Yet, in that same moment, a truth, brilliant and terrifying in its clarity, pierced through my shock, overriding the shame. This was not a failure. This was part of it. My trembling, my dropping of the host, my utter incapacitation. It was all a testament to the uncontainable, undeniable power of what was unfolding. A boy who had been shackled by earth's gravity and illness was floating. A child, whom all the world had given up for lost, was suspended in an embrace of grace, a divine tableau. And I, the priest, who had offered so many words, so many prayers, could only stand in silent, trembling witness, my own spiritual anchor momentarily lost, broken by the sheer, unadulterated force of God's love made manifest in the air. The suffering had not been answered by words, or by medicine, or by human will. It had been answered by a direct, undeniable descent of heaven into our midst, a soundless thunderclap that echoed the very moment of creation. The silence of despair had been shattered, not by a cry, but by an assent. The silence of despair had been shattered, not by a cry, but by an assent. And now, the descent. As gently as a feather guided by an unseen hand, Leo settled. His small form, which had defied the very ground beneath it, now touched the worn linoleum of the church aisle with a quiet, undeniable solidity. It was not a fall nor a stumble, but a soft return, as if gravity, having temporarily yielded to a greater power, had now been invited back, but with a new, tender respect for the child it held. The collective breath of the congregation remained held, a single frozen moment of absolute disbelief. Their faces, pale and etched with awe, were a tableau of human limitation confronted by divine infinitude. They were statues carved from astonishment, each parishioner suspended between what their eyes had just witnessed and what their minds struggled to comprehend. I, too, felt that paralysis, my trembling hands still suspended where the host had been, my heart hammering a chaotic rhythm against my ribs. The chalice remained on the altar, untouched, the sacred liturgy momentarily forgotten in the face of a far grander sacrament. Then a subtle shift. Leo, no longer slumped and listless, straightened his small frame. His limbs, once twisted and weak, were now perfectly proportioned, vibrant with a strength he had never possessed. The tension that had perpetually drawn his muscles into painful knots was gone, replaced by a fluid grace. He turned not towards the glittering tabernacle, nor the awestruck priest, but towards his mother, Maria. Her face, a moment ago a mask of grief and exhaustion, now held an expression I can only describe as a fragile, blossoming hope, struggling through the dense soil of impossible joy. Her eyes, which had for so long mirrored the pain of her son, were wide, brimming with a bewildered love. As Leo turned, she instinctively reached out, her hands hovering, afraid to touch, afraid to break the fragile spell of reality. And then, it happened. A sound that pierced the very fabric of our reality, shattering the suffocating silence of years, a silence that had defined Leo's existence. A voice, clear and sweet as a choir boy's first note, pure and unblemished by the brokenness that had once enveloped him, resonated through the hushed sanctuary. "Mama," he said. The word itself was a miracle, a revelation. It was the first word of his life, perfectly formed, imbued with an intelligence and an emotional depth that had been hidden from us for a decade. Maria gasped, a choked sob tearing from her throat, tears finally spilling down her cheeks in rivers of stunned release. Leo's gaze, once vacant and unfocused, now held a brilliant, piercing clarity. He looked directly into his mother's eyes, and in that gaze I saw not just recognition but love, understanding, and a profound innocent wisdom. St. Joseph says not to be sad anymore. God heard you. The words were a direct arrow to the heart of our shared anguish, a definitive answer to the unspoken questions that had burdened our parish for so long. St. Joseph says, Elena's relentless novena, her simple, stubborn faith, was suddenly illuminated as the true engine of this miracle. It was not my carefully crafted homilies, not David's despairing rage, not Maria's hollowed-out resignation, but the quiet, persistent prayer of a grandmother who dared to believe in the intercession of a saint, a flying friar for her silent, suffering grandson. Leo's eyes then moved, sweeping across the faces of the stunned parishioners, a curious, bright awareness in their depths. He was taking it all in, processing a world he was only now truly perceiving. His gaze settled on the empty space beside Maria, the pew where his father usually sat. "Where's Papa?" he asked, his voice still ringing with that impossible, beautiful clarity, a sound that promised so much more than mere words. In that single, breathtaking moment, all doubt was incinerated. The impossible had been made manifest, a tapestry woven from divine threads, undeniable in its beauty and its truth. The cause and effect were made plain. A grandmother's prayer, a saint's intercession, and God's profound, earth-shattering mercy. The weight of human suffering had been lifted, not by our understanding, but by His boundless love, a love that chose to break through the veil of our limitations and touch our world with a tangible, luminous grace. We had witnessed not just a healing, but a recreation, a glorious shout of affirmation in the face of silent despair. The silence, which moments before had been shattered by the impossible sound of Leo's voice, now dissolved into a symphony of quiet, incredulous sobs. Maria, her face a streaked canvas of tears and sudden radiant joy, knelt beside her son, pulling him into an embrace so fierce it seemed to compensate for years of unspoken agony. She stroked his hair, touched his face, her hands exploring the contours of a boy she knew, yet who was utterly new. "Leo," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "My little Leo." He nestled into her, his head resting against her shoulder, and the sight of their natural, easy closeness, unburdened by the apparatus of his illness, brought a fresh wave of tears to the eyes of those who witnessed it. For my part, I stood by the altar, the consecrated host now safely, reverently, returned to the tabernacle. My hands still trembled, not from fear but from the immense, palpable energy that still hummed in the air. A spiritual aftershock. I looked out at my flock, their faces a mixture of awe, confusion, and dawning understanding. Some were openly weeping, some were on their knees, heads bowed in prayer, while others simply stared, their mouths agape, struggling to reconcile what their eyes had seen with everything they had ever known. It was a holy chaos, a sacred disarray of souls touched by the divine. The weight of their shared sorrow had not simply lifted, it had been transmuted into an unspeakable joy, a communal revelation. News of the miracle spread like wildfire, carried by breathless phone calls and stunned whispers. It wasn't long before David, frantic and disbelieving, arrived. Someone in the midst of the jubilant pandemonium had managed to reach him in his workshop only a few blocks away. I saw him burst through the narthex doors, his eyes wide and wild, searching. He looked past me, past the crowd, his gaze landing on Maria and Leo in the third pew. His jaw dropped. He stumbled forward, half running, half staggering, until he reached them. He dropped to his knees, not in prayer, but in pure physical collapse. Leo, seeing his father, gently extricated himself from Maria's embrace. He walked, with a gait that was steady and strong, to David. "Papa," he said, his voice clearer than any bell, filled with an innocent, unwavering love. David reached out. His calloused carpenter's hands, which had so recently torn down a crucifix, now trembled as they touched his son's face. He traced the boy's cheekbone, his healthy neck, his firm shoulder. He looked into Leo's eyes, eyes that had once been vacant, now shone with an intelligence and awareness that mirrored his own. David didn't speak. He couldn't. He simply pulled Leo into a crushing embrace, his body racked with sobs that spoke of years of buried grief, of rage, of despair, all now washed away in an instant. His faith, once shattered, was not just repaired, but gloriously reborn, whole and incandescent. The medical community, when they finally examined Leo, could offer no explanation. The degenerative muscular disease, the neurological deficits of autism, the failing organ function, all were gone, vanished. The charts, once thick with grim prognoses, were now marked with the stark unscientific entry: spontaneous and total remission of all symptoms, cause unknown. They tested, they retested, they theorized, but the truth remained intractable to their instruments: a complete and perfect healing. Leo was indeed a new creation. He was a bright, articulate, joyous boy, eager to learn, eager to explore the world he had, until that day, only existed within. Our parish naturally was never the same. The event did not erase the memory of the suffering we had all witnessed, the heavy cross the Martinez family had borne, but it sanctified it, revealing it not as a cruel test, but as a prelude to an unimaginable grace. The stations of the cross in our church now seemed to whisper not only of sacrifice but of resurrection. Prayers became more fervent, masses more vibrant, and the community's bond, once forged in shared sorrow, was now tempered in a profound, undeniable joy. The miracle became a touchstone, a constant reminder that God is not a distant, silent observer, but an active, loving Father who steps into our broken world. I am an old priest now, my hair thinner, my steps slower, my memory for some things a little dimmer. I have seen faith flicker and fade in the face of life's relentless hardships. I have stood by countless bedsides, offering comfort where no earthly cure could be found, wrestling with the mystery of suffering. But I have also seen a boy rise from his wheelchair, float towards the altar, and speak his first words, not just of healing, but of divine intercession. I have seen the impossible made manifest, the cause and effect laid bare for all to witness, a grandmother's persistent prayer, a saint's humble intercession, and God's profound, earth-shattering mercy. And so, I know with a certainty that transcends logic or doubt, that in the deepest silence of our suffering, heaven is not just listening, it is waiting, patiently, lovingly, for the right moment to answer.